Ohio Legislative History, Part 3, Ohio Legislative History on Lexis and Westlaw. So far, this video series has discussed Ohio legislative history on the Ohio General Assembly webpage, Hannah Capital Connection, Hein Online, and a few other sources. So what about Lexis and Westlaw? Do they have legislative history materials for Ohio too? Well, they do. They have some legislative history documents available, but only for recent legislation. Coverage varies depending what documents you are interested in. If you want to know what's available, go to the Ohio Law, free websites and sources, legislative history tab, and click on Ohio Legislative Materials chart. And this will tell you what's available for what years on Lexis and Westlaw. But we're going to take a look at what's on Lexis and Westlaw in a minute. So first, let's take a look at what's on Westlaw. In our previous video, we used the example of Ohio Revised Code section 2929.03, imposing sentence for a capital offense. So let's use this as an example again. Recall that when we scroll down to the credits section, we were able to click on the various session laws and take a look at those session laws, but you notice that it only goes back so far. So on Westlaw, the session laws only go back to 1988. If you want something older than that, you're going to have to go on Hein Online, the session laws database. So notice the tabs at the top of 2929.03, and we notice that there's a history tab. So let's click on that, or we could just click directly here to our legislative history materials. And we notice that for the more recent legislation, here we have, a 2004 act, and we have also for a 2007 act. We have links to the act as well as to some LSC analysis and House and Senate journals, as well as executive messages. So it's very convenient to access legislative history that way, right from your Ohio Revised Code section and this history tab. But recall that that's only for the very most recent legislation. So if we go back to 2929.03 and we go back to the credits section, let's click on a very recent session law from the credits section. So let's click on, say, this one from 2004. We notice too that on the very recent session laws on Westlaw, you're going to have a tab up here of legislative history materials. So that's another convenient way of getting legislative history materials, at least for some pretty recent legislation. You can get even more Ohio legislative history from the Browse widget. If you go to Ohio, then you go to Ohio Statutes and Court Rules. And over on the right-hand side here, we see various ways to get into legislative history documents. Here we have Ohio Statutes Annotated Historical. This is exact copies of the Ohio Revised Code Annotated, published by Westlaw going back to 1993. We have your Ohio enacted legislation, otherwise known as the session laws. And on Westlaw, your session laws go back to 1988. We also have proposed legislation bills, which you can search. Historical bills, I believe that goes back to 2005. Bill tracking, which contains histories of the bills. And if you click on Ohio legislative history, we see here LSC analysis. That goes back to 1997, governor's message, and House and Senate journals. So now if we go over to Lexis and see what they have, here again is Ohio Revised Code Annotated 2929.03. Similar to the credit section in Westlaw, we have a history section in Lexis that tells us the session law that enacted Ohio Revised Code section, as well as the subsequent session laws that made amendments to the Ohio Revised Code section. Now you will see that I believe these start in 1991, but 1991 and later you can actually click on the session law and see a copy of it. Here's pending legislation, and they have pending legislation in Westlaw as well. And another thing they have here is archived code versions. So I could click on that and I could see different versions of this Ohio Revised Code section going all the way back to 1996. So getting back to our Ohio Revised Code section, if we click on a session law from the history section, that's 2005 or later, and then we click on Build Tracking on the right, open that up, you will see a link to legislative histories on the right. And here we see all our legislative history documents. Well, not all of them, but many legislative history documents. So in summary, remember that Lexis and Westlaw have recent legislative history documents, and Lexis and Westlaw also make these easy to find from an Ohio Revised Code section or from a session law.